Welcome to this Zoom edition of One-on-One. I'm Howie Rose, and I'm pleased to be joined today by a couple of former Mets. And we'll talk a little bit about how they came to be what they were for the Mets beginning in 1977, although Joe was here before that. But Joe Torre and Doug Flynn, and this is all brought to you by Citi. And before we get started, you should know that Citi has joined forces with And Pizza to help deliver 100,000 pies to hospital workers along the East Coast and thank the heroes working on the front lines of this COVID-19 pandemic. Now, recently, Citi enlisted the help of Pete Alonso. Who else? He's been all over the place to spread awareness of the Hero Pie program, and Mets fans can help Pete, Citi, and Pizza by going to andpizza.com. Right now, we bring on Joe Torre and Doug Flynn. And guys, both of you, just thanks for joining us during these strange circumstances. How you both doing?
Fine. I mean, it's nice to see a strange face. You know, you're incarcerated here for a while. You look around, the same people. But it's nice. It's nice being a part of this, Howie. Thank you.
Well, yeah, this has always been a strange face. How about you, Doug?
It's good. I'm like Joe. You know, we're trying to bust loose here in Kentucky. We're normally about a month and a half or a year and a half behind the rest of the world, but the golf courses are open, the fish and boat ramps are open, so life is not all that bad.
Well, Doug came to the Mets in 1977, and although Joe started with the Mets in 1975 as an active player coming over from the St. Louis Cardinals, it was around Memorial Day in 1977 that Joe became the Mets player manager, and just a couple of weeks later, Doug Flynn was acquired as part of, not straight up, although that was Doug's first response, but not straight up for Tom Seaver. He was part of the deal. But Joe, you tell an interesting story about the machinations that took place in the days leading up to your hiring as manager. Can you go through the kind of hoops you had to jump through to keep Joe Frazier, the manager, out of the loop so that you could have your interview?
It was uncomfortable, Howie. I'll tell you, we were playing our exhibition game in Tidewater, and you know, as would be, you fly into Tidewater and then fly out. We're going to Philadelphia for I think it was a weekend series. So you know, I wasn't in the game, the exhibition game, so I like. Everybody tries to get a head start on getting out of there once the game is over. So I was shaving during the game, which is a no-no if it was a normal, regular game. And then all of a sudden I see in the mirror Joe McDonald, who's the general manager, come in, and I said, uh-oh, he's going to get on my rear end for shaving during the game. And he says, how would you like to manage this team? And I said, I would like that very much. Well, he said, you meet M. Donald Grant, who's chairman of the board, the next morning in New York at his apartment. So I said, that's fine. So we got into Philadelphia, rented a car. I drove to New York, spent the night at home, and then had the meeting in the morning. And we talked about my becoming manager, and it was just an alert that when they decide to make a change, that I would be the manager. Now, whether that was next day, 2 days from now, 3 days from now, whatever it was a few days later that it happened when we did get home because we were away. And when I drive back to Philadelphia, I come to find out that Joe Frazier, the night before, was checking curfew. And I wasn't there. And you talk about uncomfortable, because I'm not going to lie to somebody. And, and he said to me, you weren't in when we checked for curfew. I said, I had to go to New York. And I said, I had a personal reason. He says, why didn't you ask me? I said, I didn't ask you because if you wouldn't allow me to go, I knew I had to go, and I didn't want to be insubordinate. So I just took off, and it was just something I needed to do. It was personal. And so that ended that. He never fined me, and but it was so uncomfortable because.
But he never pressed you on why, and you never obviously had to tell him why?
Yeah, I just said it was personal and I needed to go to New York. And if I had asked you and you said no, then I that would just be telling you I don't care what you say. And I didn't want that to be the case. So I just rented a car, headed to New York, and had the meeting and came back for the game the next day. So
and while all of that was going on, Tom Seaver was in the midst of his contract dispute with M. Donald Grant. Of course, Dick Young, the columnist, was involved in that too. And that confluence of circumstances led to Seaver's being traded to Cincinnati on June 15th, just a couple of weeks after Joe was hired as manager. Now, Doug, you're a kid from Kentucky. You're playing for your hometown team, the Cincinnati Reds. You're an infielder. I've got to think at some point you look out at second base and there's Joe Morgan. That might not work. And you look over at shortstop and there's Davey Concepcion, and well, that might not happen either. So even though you're playing for your hometown team, the Cincinnati Reds, did you welcome at least the concept of being traded to where you can play somewhere regularly?
Not at first. Not at first. Because I was told that of all the people that may have an opportunity to be traded, that I wasn't a part of that. But once I got traded, Johnny Bench pulled me up and he said, look, you know this is the best thing that can happen to you personally, because you may have an opportunity to play every day. You're not going to play here. Depending on what happens in New York, you may get a chance to play a lot more. And the best part about it, though, Howie, is when I got there is how upfront Joe was. I mean, it was a tough situation for him. For the city, for that team. I mean, you get rid of the franchise and you got a bunch of clowns coming in from Cincinnati. Nobody really knows. So, I'll never forget my first day. I walk out on the field and I got my new uniform on, got my stirrups jacked up for the first time in my career. And,
Yeah.
and some guy hollers, he says, Mr. Flynn. I thought, well, now that's nice, Mr. Flynn. I turned around, he says, you suck. And I went, well, welcome to New York.
So you had to figure it out on the fly, but Joe, you did too. I mean, here you are in the midst of all this stuff, all this turbulence around the Mets, and you're trying to figure out managing at the big league level for the first time. And I know you deactivated yourself as a player shortly after becoming the manager, but that's a lot to put on your plate too, wasn't it?
Yeah, Howie, but it was a mixed bag. You know, I was super excited to get an opportunity to manage. And I knew going in, because I had asked if I could stay on as a player and a manager. And they said, no, we don't want you to do that, but you will stay on as a player manager until we make this trade for Tom Seaver. Now, knowing that far in advance, what was going to happen by June 15th, which was the trade deadline at that time. You know, again, it's a mixed bag. It's certainly not a popular thing to trade, as Dougie points out, the franchise, but it was something that was necessary just because of the ongoing battle between M. Donald Grant and Tom Seaver, and of course Dick Young was instigating that in the meantime. But Tom was truly professional about it. He knew it was going to happen. But again, and when, you know, rumors got out that it was going to happen, you know, I'd be getting phone calls on the road telling me not to trade Tom Seaver and all this good stuff. But at the time, they weren't sure. There were two teams that they were going to trade Tom to. One was the Dodgers and one was Cincinnati. And so they wanted to leave me on the roster because they didn't know how many players were coming back for him. So I would just take a spot until that was decided. The Dodgers, it was going to be Pedro Guerrero.
A young Guerrero, yeah.
Wow.
A young Guerrero who was in the minor leagues, but he was on the disabled list at the time because he had broken his foot or his leg or something like that. And I don't think the Mets wanted to trade for somebody that couldn't show up and play. And when, you know, of course, they went to Cincinnati, they wound up, you know, with Dougie and Norman and Steve Henderson, Pat Zachary, and Joel Youngblood, I think, came over also.
He had been sent to the Cardinals, I think.
To the Cardinals, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was so, you know, when it was decided it was Cincinnati, I remember because Tom Seaver, he pitched twice for me as a starter during that time, and then his last one was in Houston, and because that was where that was the 15th. Was it Houston or yeah?
Yeah, no, the last one was in Houston,
right?
And then you went to
I
Atlanta
remember
to wait it
taking
out.
him out of the game, and he won the game, and he patted me on the rear end when he left the mound because he knew this was, his swan song with the Mets, and it was sad. But he had asked me. He says, "Can I go home, early?" Because I think it was Atlanta after that.
Yes.
That we was the 15th, and he asked me, "Can I go home early to try to avoid some of the media?" And I said, "Sure." So that the rule was you have to stay around till the game's over, but this was certainly a major exception that made sense.
And so, Doug, you come to New York, and I know that you're a middle infielder by trade. Felix Millan was still there. Buddy Harrelson was hurt a lot, and clearly his days as an everyday player were pretty much over. And so you played a ton of shortstop that first year in 1977, and as I recall, played the absolute heck out of that position. Would you have considered yourself a major league everyday shortstop as opposed to a position where you wound up winning a Gold Glove at second base?
I think probably I could have adjusted to do that. As a matter of fact, it's funny because the year after I won the Gold Glove, thanks to Joe and Jay Horowitz, we started the next year. We had a young second baseman that was pretty good, and I remember Joe came to me in spring training and he says, "Look, I know you got a Gold Glove, but I'm going to have to start you next year at shortstop." He said, "Was it Kelvin Chapman?" I think.
Right.
Yeah. And they wanted him to play, and Joe said, and I said, "Well, all right, I'll just try to win a Gold Glove at shortstop then." And short was not my natural position. I think second was a lot more natural for me, although I played short in the minor leagues. But, at that time, Howie, and I think Joe knows this, I just wanted to play. I didn't care where it was. I just wanted to play. It was fun being an everyday player in the big leagues. And, all that happened was because Joe gave me some confidence. He gave me a chance to play every day. And Joe wasn't hard to play for. Show up on time, be ready to go, and give me the best you got. If you can't do that, there's something.
And Joe, you settled cleanly into a managerial role because it's pretty obvious that it had been on your mind at some point in the latter stages of your playing career that you wanted to manage a ball club. When did that begin to sort of take hold on you, that this was your future beyond playing?
Well, when I was with St. Louis, and I played for Red Shandies for 6 years, he was a former player. I learned a lot from watching him, and basically his philosophy was trusting the players, and the game belongs to the players. And I don't think I ever changed that philosophy. In fact, Bob Gibson used to, poke me in the dugout and say, "Tell Red to do this. Tell Red to do that." So I'd go up and tell Red to do this and tell Red to do that. And when it didn't work, I made sure I got myself clear of where Red was, but he sort of accused me of managing over there in St. Louis. But meanwhile, a lot of it was his prodding. He didn't know anything about baseball other than pitching. But, I still respected, who he was. And, and I followed his lead for a while. But that's basically where I got the bug for wanting to manage, and then, going to New York and starting my first season there. I had a horrible year in 75, and then became basically a pinch hitter in 76, and basically that's what I started 77 as. And the interesting part, Howie, I don't know if you know this, although I've talked about it before, was during the end of the 76 season. Joe McDonald came up to me. He says, "How would you like to go to the Yankees?" And I said, and I thought about it, it's something I wanted to jump at because I had never been in postseason during my playing career. And the Yankees were obviously going to win the pennant. And I said, not if it helps the club, fine, but not if I'm going to be considered if in the event they ever make a managerial change here. I would rather, stay here. And I remember talking to M. Donald Grant about that and explained it the same way I just said. And again, I'm not sure, obviously it never happened that I got traded to the Yankees, but I'm not sure if what I said, changed their mind, or the fact that they never could agree on a player or money or whatever it was. So that's what happened in 76. And so that's, I think, the first time I planted the seed with them that I was interested in managing. If a change was ever made, I wanted to be considered.
And Doug, did you ever consider managing or coaching after your playing career? You do a heck of a job at fantasy camp with that. I'm not sure that works on a resume, but
close to the same thing. I actually managed and coached a year in the Met organization. I had a job when I got out of baseball and came home, and I was working with the governor's office for 10 years, and then went back into baseball. So yeah, I coached and managed, and I was looking to maybe move on up the ladder in that capacity, but I got a job offer here at Central Bank, and I've been here 22 years now, and it's really been a blessing to get a chance to stay locally. So yeah, I did think about it. It was, it would have been fun because and not from the standpoint that I thought I knew so much baseball. It's just knew that I made so many stupid mistakes that hopefully I can help not do that.
I'll tell you one thing, Howie. Dougie, he was ferocious. He went out there and played aggressively the game. You had to like, what it looked like. Again, he knew how to play the game. Cincinnati was an organization at that time that certainly taught you the fundamentals and taught you how to play the game right. But the one thing that we used to bang heads on was don't swing at that first pitch, because with the first ball fastball hitter was Doug Flynn, and didn't matter where it was, over the top of his head, behind him, anything, he'd swing at it. So I put him in the leadoff spot, and I made him take a strike. He hated me for, I don't know, days on end with that. But meanwhile, he was always ball one, ball two, now go ahead and hack at it. But yeah, he wanted to swing from right now. And
Joe, I was such a bad hitter, and I look back, but I mean, I look back at my high school days. All these guys were hitting 600. I was trying to hit 280 in high school, but I felt like, gosh, I want to contribute somehow, so I'm going to go up there and hack, instead of realizing that I could have been contributing, just getting on base and taking pitches. But it was so fun. I mean, we weren't. I felt so bad for Joe because, he was hoping that we were going to get some better talent to come in there and play. We had a bunch of young kids. We all, for the first time, were getting an opportunity to be big league ball players. New York City. It was pretty special. I'll tell you what. People say, the 2 years in Cincinnati in the big leagues, they were awesome, obviously. But there's nothing like an everyday player going to the ballpark and know you get a chance to go out and compete with some of the best of the best. Man, Joe, I will always be indebted to you for giving me that chance.
Well, the way I looked at it, we got young players in this deal, and the only way you're going to find out is to throw them out in there and teach them to swim. And you'd have I'd have the players, Danny Norman or whoever it was, take a pitch and and hit with the bases loaded, where normally if you were fighting for a pennant, you may pinch hit, but how are you ever going to know if that person is qualified to hit in that situation?
You know, one of the guys who came over with Doug from Cincinnati was Steve Henderson. And, you know, Andre Dawson just barely beat him out for Rookie of the Year in '77. And Steve didn't even get to the big leagues until mid-June, obviously. When you saw Henderson for the first time, Joe, did you think he was going to be a star? Because he never quite built on that great rookie year. What kept him from taking that next step, as you recall?
You know, he willed himself to do well. You know, again, he didn't care what it looked like. I mean, Andre Dawson, obviously, Hall of Famer, was a special talent. But Hendu, I mean, he'd get up there and battle you. He wouldn't give anything. He'd fight for every at bat. Very respectful, a lot of character. You know, he was a hitting coach in a lot of different spots, and you just knew that you wanted this guy going to war with you. You know, he was a little short ability-wise, especially comparing him to Andre Dawson. A lot of us were, but this kid just, you know, as I say, he'd go out and play and come home dirty, man. He just play as hard as he could for as long as he could, and not be afraid to fail.
And a great guy too. And Doug, you know, you came over in under such controversial circumstances, but is there a bond even to this day that exists between you, Steve, and even Dan Norman and Pat Zachary, of course, because you came under the identical set of circumstances? Is that something that kind of keeps you close even more than 40 years later?
Yes, believe it or not, it does. And you know that you're always going to be in that conversation. They brought us all back on the 25th anniversary of the trade. And it's the only time that all of us have been together with Tom. And each one of us, I think, looked at Tom, especially Stevie Henderson. He said it for all of us. You know, Tom, we were pretty much going to be buried over the organization we were with. And because of the circumstances that happened, your trade gave us all a chance to be big league ball players. And so there's always been that respect. And I think Joe will tell you too, Seaver was one of the classier people that ever played the game. He was a true professional. Johnny Bench told me once, I said, how did I end up in the trade? He said, well, they already had the three guys. And he said, I told Sparky, throw Doug in there. And I went, so you traded me? And he's become just a dear friend over all these years. But he said, yeah, he says, you're not going to play here. And he said, get you a chance where maybe you got an opportunity. So, I've been blessed. I told somebody, I still have a lot of people get on me about my hitting, but I finally learned at the ripe young age of 69 that I'm not going to let anything that's written about me steal the joy that I have, and I had and still have, of being a big league ball player. It's just nothing like it.
Hey, let me just tell a story, if you don't mind, Howie.
Sure.
This was how I got traded from St. Louis. To St. Louis from the Braves. Bob Gibson tells me this story. He said that Bing Devine, who was the general manager at the time, come up to him. He says, how do you, what do you think of Joe Torre? And he says, oh, yeah, get him. He's really good. He has a good arm, blah, 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 catcher, and this, that, and the other thing. I was traded for Orlando Cepeda, who was the MVP in the National League. And he went over to Bing Devine. He says, when I said trade for Torre, I didn't mean trade Orlando Cepeda.
Well, you know what? Now, that's a great story. And Doug, tell me if this one is true, because you just said that Johnny Bench was instrumental in getting you traded out of Cincinnati. Is it true that you are married to a woman that you were fixed up with by Pete Rose?
That is true.
Well, that's pretty good. So Bench trades you and Rose sets you up with your wife.
Yeah. I was in New York. Joe knows Olga, and we were going to Philadelphia to play. And Pete and I were going to go out to dinner after the ball game. And usually we went to dinner. He would bring his girlfriend then, now wife, to eat. And Pete and I talked baseball, and she just sit there. So I just said, why don't you tell Carol to bring a friend, and then if she'll have somebody to talk to. So I get on first that night somehow, and Pete says, did you see the girls? And I went, no. He said, well, I got good news and bad news. I went, well, what's the bad news? He said, the girl coming tonight is engaged. I said, Pete, I can get my own dates. I'm not worried about that. Joe puts a hit and run on, and I said, Pete, I can hit and run. I got to go. And as I'm taking off for second, Pete says, looks good. And 8 months later, we get married. Now 38 years later.
That's outstanding. So in some ways, he could have been your general manager for getting that thing.
Yeah.
Right? And Joe, I never asked you this, I don't think. But you've done everything in baseball, obviously, becoming a Hall of Fame manager, and most recently a special assistant to the commissioner, which is your job now. You've been the chief baseball officer. You won an MVP. You've done everything in baseball except become a general manager. Was that ever anything you aspired to?
No, I didn't think I was smart enough to do that, to be honest with you. In fact, when I was fired by the Cardinals, and this was in 95, I guess it was in the fall of 95, I get a call from Gene Michael, who was at that time the general manager of the Yankees, and asked me if I'd be interested in interviewing for that job, because he was going to step aside and become George's assistant or whatever it was. So I met with him, and we spoke about it. They offered me the job as GM with the Yankees, and I said, I asked a question that I knew the answer to. I said, is there any vacation time? And he said, no, there isn't. I said, well, I respectfully want to decline because my wife, Allie, is pregnant with our daughter, and I really can't commit to that at this point in time. I said, but thank you for the offer. It helps my ego, especially after you've been fired. I said, but if you need anything, information on someone that I can help you with, don't hesitate to call. I think it was a week or 10 days, 2 weeks, whatever it was later, I got a call from Arthur Richmond, who was assistant to George at the time. And he says, how would you like to be on the list of being considered for Yankee manager? And I said, heck yeah. And I was added to the list that had Sparky Anderson and Davey Johnson and Tony La Russa. Well, La Russa had my job in St. Louis. Davey Johnson already committed to Baltimore, and Sparky had retired. So I was in pretty good shape, being the only one left on that list.
It's a shame that little deal didn't work out, isn't it, Howie?
Yeah, right. And things worked out for you pretty interestingly, too, because, look, Joe Torre is born and bred New Yorker. You always knew it was going to work out for Joe in New York. You come to New York from Kentucky, and next thing you know, Doug's playing with the Oak Ridge Boys. You're at the old Lone Star Cafe and Cody's and every place else. This city seemed to fit you like a glove, too, didn't it?
Well, I didn't go into it too much, believe me. You could get in a lot of trouble, and I didn't know how to handle that. So that's why I kept moving further away from the city. I started off when I got there, lived in the city for 2 weeks. Then I moved to Queens, and then I moved out to Long Island. So you didn't really commute too much down to the city when we were playing. But, yeah, they found out about us doing it. Matter of fact, when I signed my contract and Joe was there, we did it at a little country music place and having some fun. I brought up about 17 other Kentuckians. You talking about rednecks infiltrating the city. Never been so many cowboy hats at one time, I don't think, in the city. But it was fun, and I enjoyed doing that in the off season. It's just, yeah, it's been a magical ride for me. I'm just very thankful and very blessed.
Am I wrong, Joe, to say, because this is based on my own recollections as a very young reporter, and we're talking well over 40 years now, for a team that didn't have a great deal of success on the field, it seemed that the core of that team, Joe, were fairly close and had a pretty significant amount of fun. I mean, that's the vibe that I got being in that clubhouse. It wasn't a lot of factions. It wasn't a lot of guys just out for themselves. A lot of young kids that had come to the big leagues in a lot of ways together, same time. Was it more fun, Joe, than people might imagine, given that you didn't win as many games as you would have liked?
You know what? It really was, Howie, because you had guys, and again, as Doug pointed out earlier, the only thing I ever ask from my players, not everybody's going to hit 40 homers or win 20 games, but everybody can do the best they can. And I really judged everybody his ability on the fact that they did what they could, and they can't do anything more than that. But it was a good group. They played hard. I'll tell you that one year, you have to sort of dangle carrots for yourself. That one year, I think we had to win the last 7 or 8 games in a row, not to lose 100 games.
79,
yeah. And I tell you, I was pretty proud of that club being able to bite and scratch with nothing at stake whatsoever.
Oh, by the way, I just remember this because you were talking about that team. Joe was the first guy ever to break the news to me that a player was ticked off at me. And that player was Doug Flynn. And I was so proud of it because I'm a 23-year-old kid working at a country music station, WHN, doing sports in the morning as their sports director. No teams on the air. It was kind of like being the captain of a rowboat, but it worked. It was a nice business card. And I guess I said something one morning that I guess we're into September, maybe it was even late August. The Mets are playing out the string, and they'll be at home tonight against the Phillies or whatever. And Joe sees me at the ballpark. He says, "Hey, Flynn's ticked off at you." Do you remember that, Joe, at all?
Yeah, I remember that. When you're in the locker room in Cincinnati, you got 5 reporters, and that's a busy night. You walk in the locker room in New York, you got 105 reporters that are all looking, and I don't think I took exception. If you want to say I stink, good, but don't say we were playing out the string. Don't say we weren't playing hard. We could say we played bad, but don't say, because I don't know of anybody that was really laying down. I mean, you look at Stearns. Stearns is still trying to give it all he's got.
I gotta tell you, finish your thought, Dougie. I gotta tell you a Stearns story.
But so I think when the writers would say, I didn't mind anybody saying, you booted a ball or you made a bad play. We weren't playing hard. And I think I exception.
He's still talking to me.
Well, the thing is, you turn the page, Howie. You turn the page.
That's it.
Well, thanks. We're going to stop here. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to have a little more content from this interview available for you, and that is going to be at cityentertainment.com. So join us there.